I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. In 1787, when the framers of our Constitution began with "We the people of the United States," in order to form a more perfect union, their intention was for citizens to engage with the Constitution as a living document, one that could be amended to reflect the intelligence, justice, and circumstances of each generation to follow. The framers counted on and expected every citizen to participate in the politics of government, continuing their work towards becoming a more just and perfect union. Even though at that time, the only citizens whose voices were to be heard were those of white male landowners. Throughout history, changes have been made at times of intense social pressure and shifting attitudes. Advancing the promise of a living constitution, the Founding Fathers came to the realization that slavery was both divisive and immoral, and amended the Constitution to abolish slavery. The women's right to vote came about through social consciousness and persistent pressure over a 70-year period, making it clear to the President and Congress what had been intolerable for women. In each case, it was the recognition of injustice and strong public pressure that the Constitution was able to be set into place, the 13th and 19th Amendment, furthering the framers' promise of a living Constitution, addressing oppression, and furthering the work of forming a more perfect union. Where have we come from in our history? And more importantly, where are we going? Will the lure of power and influence blind us to our own detriment? What are the mistakes we've made in the past? And if we choose to continue as a democracy, how do we make certain that we do not recreate these same mistakes for ourselves again? In order to learn from one of our country's biggest mistakes, the internment of Japanese American families held against their will in American concentration camps during World War II, we have to understand the conditions which made it politically feasible and publicly acceptable to deprive American citizens of their constitutional rights. In 1980, a federal commission was created by Congress to study the causes that brought about the internment of nearly 120,000 members of Japanese American families. After 3 years of hearings, in 1983, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians published their findings in a report called Personal Justice Denied, citing the 3 main causes of the internment. The first cause was racism. Japanese immigrants began arriving in the United States during the 1880s, replacing Chinese laborers who were no longer welcome. Although the Chinese composed an insignificant number of the nation's population, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in order to appease worker demands and satisfy prevalent concerns about maintaining white racial purity. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States. Because the Chinese had been targets of racism, and the new Japanese immigrants had physical characteristics similar to the Chinese, the Japanese people were ostracized, labeled as different, untrustworthy, and treated as less than human. Anti-Japanese agitation also fed on racial stereotypes and the fear of so-called yellow peril. The Asian population seemed to be growing faster than the white population, even though the ethnic Japanese never exceeded 3% of everyone living in California. There was a commonly accepted bogus theory that Japanese could not or would not assimilate into the American culture, and those who spoke English poorly or with a heavy accent were particularly ostracized. As with the Jewish people in Nazi Germany, having been blamed for many of Germany's economic troubles, Japanese Americans were a convenient scapegoat of demagogues eager to place blame for any number of political and economic issues. Because the principal occupation of Japanese immigrants was in agriculture, they received significant hostility from white farmers, who perceived them as an economic threat. Yet after years of living productive lives in the United States, in the eyes of the US government, the Japanese were here strictly as laborers, never to be given the right to own land, and never permitted a path to citizenship. That was then. This is now. Where is racism today? The second cause for the internment of Japanese Americans was determined to be war hysteria, which today would be called the politics of fear or fear-mongering. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was a widespread belief, contrary to all evidence, that the attack had been aided by the sabotage and espionage of ethnic Japanese living in Hawaii. This fear and scapegoating erupted into anger and hate, punishing innocent people by burning their homes, stealing their property, taking their farms and businesses, and otherwise undermining their self-worth, pride, and their sense of personal dignity. From politicians to journalists, in movies and books, in schools, universities, and national organizations, each incited fear through socially accepted derogatory propaganda. Any American of Japanese ancestry was the hated enemy. These fears were what allowed those in power to justify racist policies, with the argument that imprisoning ethnic Japanese living on the West Coast was necessary in order to protect the safety of Americans. This justification completely negated the fact that most of those sent to the camps were American citizens. Fear is a dangerous thing. It has been used to justify some of the most heinous actions, completely outweighing the importance of facts. In America today, you can shoot and kill another person and walk away without punishment if you can prove that you were afraid and acting out of self-defense, regardless of whether your fear was justified. But we rarely stop to wonder where fear comes from. Some have said it originates from memories of prehistoric survival clashes that remain hidden in our limbic brain, suggesting it's a subconscious mechanism that sees the other as a threat. Is it rational? Or is fear irrational, stemming from thoughts or feelings based on repeated exposure to messages from the media, from institutional practices, cultural ideology, or from family bias passed down from one generation to the next? That was then. This is now. Where is the politics of fear today? The third cause for the internment of Japanese Americans was determined to be the failure of political leadership. Part of the failure of political leadership was political self-preservation at the cost of Japanese American lives. No politician wanted to be blamed for further attacks on American soil for failing to take action, so even those who felt differently about what was being decided failed to speak out. Decisions based on keeping one's job overrode the actual search for truth. Some agencies in the federal government were for the incarceration, while others were against it. It was never a unanimous decision, but when enough power and influence was brought to bear by both political parties, the decision was made to imprison Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. The president's executive order was a blatant violation of the 14th Amendment. The cause for this breach of the 14th Amendment was later on acknowledged to be a fabrication based on racial fear. The Assistant Secretary of War at the time revealed the prevailing attitude of those in charge when he said, "The Constitution is just a piece of paper to me." Conversely, reports from other government agencies studying the potential threat from Japanese Americans on the West Coast stated that the Japanese people were extremely loyal to the United States and therefore there was no need for imprisoning them because of a so-called military necessity. These reports, however, were never taken into account. President Roosevelt, giving way to his own racial bias and receiving intense political pressure from Congress, violated his only oath of office, namely to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. He signed Executive Order 9066, stating that the Japanese internment was a military necessity. On February 19, 1942, the president sentenced nearly 120,000 innocent people to American concentration camps. That was then. This is now. Where is the failure of political leadership today? Powerful, ambitious men, blind to their own prejudice, helped to spread this race-based sense of fear, and were major contributors to the failure of political leadership. Justification for internment from people like Chief Justice Earl Warren, then the Attorney General of California, helped to seal the fate of Japanese American people. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Warren organized the state's civil defense program, warning in January of 1942 that the Japanese situation as it exists in this state today may well be the Achilles heel of the entire civil defense effort. Warren was a vocal proponent of forcibly removing all Japanese Americans from the West Coast. It was only years later, after retiring as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that Warren wrote in his memoirs, "I deeply regretted the removal order and my own testimony advocating it, because it was not in keeping with our American concept of freedom and the rights of citizens. Whenever I thought of the innocent little children who were torn from home, school, friends, and congenial surroundings, I was conscience-stricken. It was wrong to react so impulsively, without positive evidence of disloyalty." As the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, this was his deepest source of shame and most egregious failure, knowing that even regret was not enough to erase the damage he had done. Another example of men who wielded their power and prejudice to further the effect of racist fear came from the unlikely pen of Theodore Seuss Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. In his editorial cartoons, Seuss took advantage of the physical differences between Japanese and Europeans. His cartoons aided to increase paranoia and fear, especially on the West Coast. Later on, however, as he began to understand how his work was supporting the spread of anti-Japanese propaganda, Seuss worked to make amends for what he had done. He traveled to Japan to experience and learn who the Japanese people really were. Upon his return, he wrote the book Horton Hears a Who, in which he stresses the power of a single voice making all the difference for the people of a tiny city called Whoville. When you look at the three causes of internment cited by the Commission, namely racism, war hysteria, or the politics of fear, and the failure of political leadership, it's not difficult to find parallels in our current political system. The evidence is in the way immigrants are scapegoated for stealing jobs, or the fear-mongering around terrorism and American Muslims, and the extreme polarization and culture wars that plague our system. If we want to answer the question, could this happen again, we have to examine how fear operates in America today. Are minority groups seen consciously or subconsciously as a threat, whether economic, cultural, or physical, to the point that depriving them of civil rights would be justified? Does fear make it more acceptable to detain immigrant children in cells or impose blanket travel bans on entire countries? If there is a lesson to be learned from the Japanese internment, or the Holocaust, or any subjugation, internment, or genocide of minority, it's that none of these examples are carried out solely by a handful of self-serving men. They were carried out with the consent of thousands of otherwise good people, whose non-involvement made them complicit in an atrocious infringement on human rights. In order to convince good people to deprive others of their rights, you have to make good people think it's for their own protection. that their fear is rational and thus their actions are justified. If we begin with this belief that all evil is done by people who believe they are doing good, at some point we have to look in the mirror and ask what our own role is in the perpetuation of racism and injustice in the United States. In January of 1838, President Abraham Lincoln gave a speech to a group of young men at the Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois, on the perpetuation of our institutions. He said, in essence, the end of our republic would never come from a foreign attack. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined could not, by force, take us. If it ever reaches us, it will spring up from amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and its finisher. As a nation of free people, we must either live through all time or die by suicide. Both politically and socially, we will always be at a crossroads, a decision place where political challenges and personal involvement in our country will test us. Threatening conditions of racism, the politics of fear, and the failure of political leadership, along with a flagrant appetite for power and influence, will always be at hand and will either make us a nation of grateful immigrant descendants or break us as a failed democratic experiment. Our first president, George Washington, expressed genuine concern that the alternate domination of one political party over another, allowing one party to enjoy temporary power over the government, would be used to obtain revenge on the other. Washington understood that if a wise people did not do their duty to discourage and restrain the overzealous development of political parties, it would be the end of America and the Constitution. For Washington, as Constitutional Convention President and later President of the United States, his most important role was to create an atmosphere that would allow convention members, framers of our Constitution, to reach the difficult compromises necessary to create a bold new government. Awareness, social consciousness, responsibility, and most importantly, involvement is what the framers of the Constitution called for when they gave us "We the People," the challenge, responsibility, and privilege to use our commitment and creativity to continue the work of forming a more perfect union. This begins with each of us using our voice to vote in our elections and actively involving ourselves in the legislative process. It begins with looking inward to explore the ways we unconsciously perpetuate and participate in various kinds of racism and injustice. And it begins with recognizing that unlearning deeply rooted associations and stereotypes is an ongoing process of reprogramming our brains to be less afraid, more like an ongoing process of brushing our teeth rather than pulling out a tooth and thinking the work is done. The notion of being a responsible citizen doesn't just begin and end at the ballot box. Responsible citizenry includes how we work for justice in our personal lives, at the office, in our schools, in our children's schools, and in our local communities. Our choice and our challenge today is to further the Constitution's promise by engaging our talents, our hard work, our creativity, and our imaginations, whatever it takes, to reinvent ourselves and our country. This isn't the time for business as usual. This is the time for each of us to involve ourselves, standing up for what we believe in, working diligently and purposefully to make it happen. Our families are counting on it. Our neighbors are counting on it. And our country is counting on it.